really delighted to welcome Chester Johnson back to the cathedral. He was here a year ago talking about his book on Auden, the Psalms, and me, the story of the retranslation of the Psalms for the Book of Common Prayer, on which Auden and Chester were the poets on the drafting committee. And that's when we recite the Psalms in the Book of Common Prayer, think of Chester Johnson as the genius of the place. Okay, now this year he has come through an odyssey in the publication of Damaged Heritage. And I was going to think of all kinds of smart things to say about Chester and the book, but far better than my talents is the description that Douglas Blackman gave. He's a Pulitzer Prize author of Slavery by Another Name, the re-enslavement of Black Americans from the Civil War to World War II. And this is what he said about Chester and his book. Chester Johnson is of that generation of Southern-born white people who come of age in the 1960s, deep in the heart of American apartheid. In hometowns, they were taught to see as perfections of the American dream. Then they were tortured first by personal discovery of the white supremacist evil that suffused their idyllic worlds, then tortured by the failure of peers to make the same discovery, and finally tortured by revelations of the complicity of people they loved and admired most. In Damaged Heritage, Johnson poignantly reveals the demons he discovered in his own life and family, ties to one of the worst racial horrors in American history, his personal anguish and his efforts to make amends and fill a desperate empty place in our hearts. Only a poet can see this clearly, be this honest, and still hope so much. I'm so pleased that Chester Johnson is with us today to tell us the story of his discovery and how he and Sheila Walker together made something beautiful for God. Chester Johnson.
Thank you, Gabe, and thank you, Dana. I am JChester Johnson, and I'm delighted to talk with you again. As both Gabe and Dana indicated, I was with you recently to discuss my last book, which is decidedly different from the one released last month, Damaged Heritage, the Elaine Race Massacre, and a Story of Reconciliation, published by Pegasus and distributed by Simon Schuster. I plan to talk for no more than 25 minutes, and then we can have a question and answer session to carry us further into the book and associated topics. As we walk through the messages and contours of this book, I wish to underscore a crucial fact. Maybe I sound like I just left the Mississippi River Delta, though I've lived in New York City for many decades. Or maybe parts of the presentation sound apropos of headline Southern experience. But please do not assume this is a Southern book. It is not. While the South may carry a more glaring history of damaged heritage and its effect on racial subjugation, let us not be misled. Damaged heritage is a national problem, and wherever its use by whites against African Americans exists, in this book is relevant. I was asked to write the Litany of Offense and Apology for the National Day of Repentance, October the 4th, 2008, when the Episcopal Church formally apologized, with the presiding bishop officiating, for its role in transatlantic slavery and related evils. As I conducted my research, I came across a 70-page treatise entitled The Arkansas Race Riot of 1919, written by the African-American historian and anti-lynching advocate, Ida B. Wells. It told of a terrible slaughter of Black sharecroppers and their family members, possibly the worst attack against African Americans in our country's history, with over 100 and possibly hundreds of Blacks perishing in Phillips County, located in southeast Arkansas along the Mississippi River Delta. I grew up in southeast Arkansas, one county removed from the site of the massacre. None of my friends nor I ever knew a thing about this terrible event. I never heard about it at school and social gatherings at church. As I was to discover, for virtually everyone in the United States, the Elaine Race Massacre didn't exist as a murderous act in American history. Partially out of sheer anger that I had been duped by the evanescence of uncomfortable history, I began to examine attacks in Southeast Arkansas against African Americans around the time of the Elaine Race Massacre after the end of World War I, and found that there had been lynchings and burnings of blacks alive in the area, but none of these horrific and pernicious actions resulted in the 100+ deaths that occurred in the Elaine Race Massacre. I also began to recall a crucial personal story my mother told me many years before about my maternal grandfather, Lonnie Birch, the principal caretaker during the first 5 years of my life. She told me that when she was young, not yet a teenager, Lonnie, who had been a member of the Ku Klux Klan, participated in what she called a well-known race riot, where many blacks were killed in Southeast Arkansas. My father died when I was 1, and my mother didn't do well for several years, so I lived with my maternal grandparents, Lonnie and Hattie Birch. Lonnie had just retired from the Missouri Pacific Railroad, and he became my 24-hour-a-day caretaker. He was singularly the most important person during my earliest years. I adored him, and he adored me. Over time, based on my research, I concluded that the Elaine Race Massacre and the well-known race riot my mother relayed to me about my grandfather were one and the same. The terrain, the location of the killing field, proximity of the Birch farm, the significant role played by the Missouri Pacific Railroad, Lonnie's only employer his entire working career, the large number of African Americans killed, and much more all led to the same conclusion. My beloved grandfather had participated in the Elaine Race Massacre. In 1957 and 1958, this story about Lonnie and Elaine, together with a discussion about the then current racial turmoil, found their way into conversations between my mother and me when I was a young teenager at the time of a nearby federal state constitutional crisis unfolding before us on television, radio, and in every newspaper. This crisis surrounded the integration of Little Rock Central High School, 100 miles away from Monticello, Arkansas, where I then lived. The subject of white racism, including its tragic and emotional divisiveness, has been with me ever since. I've studied it, I've spoken and written about it. It has also affected my life's physical migrations. During the summer of 1964, I sat in Quincy House along the Charles River at Harvard University. It was the summer before my junior year at Harvard. In June and July, hundreds of mostly white Northern students descended on Mississippi to register black voters, to upset the state's racial norms, open schools and political operations. All this cumulatively known as Freedom Summer. While the target of this northern advance was institutionalized racism, the geographic area given most attention was Northwest Mississippi, the area of the state conventionally known as the Delta, the sister locale just across the Great Muddy from Arkansas, Phillips County in Monticello, my hometown. No wonder then that I dwelt repeatedly on accounts originating some 1,500 miles away. In the summer of 1964, the United States embarked on a racial reckoning. A battle beginning with the South as the target, but flaring into a national outrage for racial grievances everywhere. With black and white players frequently bearing a Southern accent, one heard ancient outcries for and against moral and human rectitude. Many of us think of that summer as the fulcrum, a torch that sent the nation into a racial revolution that has never ended. First, 3 civil rights workers with Freedom Summer were martyred in June in Neshoba County, Mississippi, followed by 200 federal investigators flooding the county to find the bodies of Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner. A search much of the nation followed with intensity and sympathetic anger. Then in July, the first seminal civil rights legislation of the 20th century was enacted by Congress and President Johnson, around the same time that the Harlem race riots erupted as a harbinger of internal combustions and infernos for succeeding summers, when ghetto riots spread like viral wildfires through American cities, one after another. A monumental question arose for me then. Should I continue to observe from afar in Cambridge, Massachusetts, or encounter for myself a turn to the other side of history? Looking back over time, I don't think I had a choice. For 3.5 years, I returned to the South and traveled through the region. I held a couple of jobs, wrote, and now and then attended classes at the University of Arkansas until I accumulated enough credits, together with my Harvard credits, to graduate. When I left Harvard in 1964, I came back to the South after Freedom Summer, mainly as a student, although I had my inclinations and underlying suppositions about the country's racial revolution. By 1968, as I left Arkansas for New York City, I had a firm grasp of myself in the context of race and the Black liberation movement. Then, following the murder of Martin Luther King Jr., I returned once again to the Mississippi River Delta, to Southeast Arkansas, but this time I put my more congealed and codified views about race and Black liberation to work by teaching in an all-African-American public school before integration of the local public education system. The significance and symbolic relevance of Freedom Summer are often dismissed today, intentionally so by many whites, I might add. For example, the following bit of history is usually forgotten or misplaced in retrospect. But Ronald Reagan, immediately following the Republican convention that launched his 1980 campaign as the party's nominee against Jimmy Carter, chose as his first campaign stop Neshoba County, Mississippi, where the 3 civil rights workers had been brutally murdered by violent segregationists at the beginning of Freedom Summer. Reagan's states' rights message that early fall day in 1980 in Neshoba County was meant to appeal to those whites both in Mississippi and across the nation who had seen the 1964 racial liberation efforts in Mississippi coming from the North as a Sherman-esque invasion to perpetrate unwarranted and prodigal attacks on justified and long-lasting white supremacy. I grew up in an especially racist family in an especially racist region along the Mississippi River Delta, a region that heads of the NAACP had dubbed the Heart of Darkness, a region that has also been called part of the American Congo. 5 years after the Episcopal Church apologized for its role in slavery and related evils, I wrote a 10,000-word article for a literary magazine on the massacre, which started a journey to reconciliation and deep friendship with Sheila Walker, a descendant of African Americans who were victims of the conflagration in Phillips County. Sheila wrote the foreword to Damaged Heritage. I learned something disturbing about myself through the writing of that article. Notwithstanding the preponderance of facts and evidence that Lonnie had participated in the massacre, I used the term likely to describe his role. I had no excuse to use the ameliorative word likely. Shortly thereafter, though, as a result of my long-time rejection of the racist apparatus that surrounded me during my youth. I simply could not let my feelings and familial attachment for Lonnie erase or obscure the image of the racist person he had so clearly been. He then became and remains two distinctly separate people. A beautiful and caring grandfather from a less welcomed memory, but also an abhorrent gunman who sought to kill African Americans in the 1919 mass murder. My use of the term likely ultimately caused me to explore ways white Americans have frequently reacted to their collective and individual damaged heritage that has brought subjugation to blacks over generations and several centuries. As a result of this personal challenge, I came to uncover the ability of generations of whites to tolerate the terrible treatment of blacks in America. I acknowledge my attempt, as so many American whites, especially large numbers of white Southerners, had done before me, to lessen the effects of damaged heritage. It is crucial we understand that white folks have shielded themselves from damaged heritage through the adoption of an excessive veneration of ancestors, the past, and traditions, a feature Webster calls filial pietism. I believe both damaged heritage and filial pietism taken together are serious components of long-term and continuing racism. In fact, the influence of damaged heritage on white racism bears little potent capability without the psychological cover from filial pietism, which is excused, camouflaged, and sufficiently inoculated damaged heritage throughout the entirety of our national history. We humans are not born with racism as a natural result of who we innately are. Rather, it is a trait we absorb as a condition of what we learn and have to unlearn if we are to free ourselves from this evil. I like to think that the commonality between all humans, let's call this commonality the genuinely human, far outweighs any differences in custom, history, background, skin color, language, manners, and rituals. Unfortunately, meager differences in these facets between us have often suggested to many whites the perfect reason for exclusion, separation, and isolation of others. With the genuinely human in mind, I recall comments for guidance from the philosopher Soren Kierkegaard, who wrote 170 years ago that one generation does not learn anything genuinely human from a past generation. In other words, we have to learn ever anew for ourselves the genuinely human, which certainly proved to be a remedy leading to the last 6 years of my reconciliation and friendship with Sheila Walker, descendant of Elaine victims. Kierkegaard's view that one generation cannot rely on a previous generation to learn the genuinely human warns us that filial pietism must and will inevitably embrace racism, at least in white America's case, since that revered past cast African Americans in a perpetual state of human subjugation. Therefore, we whites have to be especially careful today about those traditions to which we adhere. For if we're not, they will surely, as they have in the past, contain racist justification brought forward again and again. I believe my ancestors knew that their subjugation of blacks was decidedly wrong. The mere existence of filial pietism proves that they used reverence for the past to shadow and hide damaged heritage. We would indeed be wise, therefore, to ask ourselves this question today. Are there traditions that we now blindly adopt for ourselves that directly or indirectly endorse racism and thus project their power and existence for tomorrow? And yet we should also feel eagerly challenged that we alone can open ourselves to the genuinely human, not bound by those who come before. During the writing of my 2013 article on the Elaine Race Massacre, I had reached out to the writer Robert Whitaker, author of On the Lapse of Gods, the most definitive book on the Elaine Race Massacre. I asked him several questions to achieve clarification for my piece. In turn, he asked if I would meet an African-American woman, a descendant of a family that experienced terrible white attacks during the massacre. I agreed. Sheila also agreed to meet with me, the two of us, progenies of the two sides. For our first communication in early 2014, Sheila and I had a telephone call that lasted 2 hours. We shared much personal information about our ancestors, victims, and perpetrator. We were both very comfortable with the conversation, notwithstanding some anxiety before the call. Several weeks later, Sheila and I met at her son's home in Boston. Whitaker picked me up at the train station and drove me to the house where Sheila's son, his wife, and their small children lived. As Bob pulled up in front of the house, I inadvertently peered at the second-story windows, and my eyes met those of a person I knew had to be Sheila. How long had she watched for us from the window? Sheila obviously shared a similar searching exercise I practiced in anticipation of that day. Immediately upon greeting each other, we embraced for a very long time. From the beginning, we meant to be the obverse, the alternative to the attitudes and episodes that characterized those early fall days of 1919 in Phillips County, Arkansas. Our friendship and reconciliation have now continued for over 6 years, with our spouses and children being brought into this relationship. Our journey, apparent from the outset, remained a road to reconciliation that recognized imperative history, which made sense of all we learned from beginning to end, discounting none of the most intrusive facts, regardless how uncomfortable. This is no small matter. The truth brought forward affects the way we act and react today and tomorrow. Based on revised and true history, we inevitably adjust our current behavior. For the relationship that developed out of our mutual history from the massacre, Sheila and I empowered our adherence to the genuinely human as a steadfast election on which we deeply depended. I've learned that we white folks often have a problem with both racial reconciliation and forgiveness. Oh, there may be the seemingly affirmative comments about blacks and whites getting along, but that's not what reconciliation and forgiveness are. The getting along test doesn't solve it. Since Lonnie remained for me divided between my beloved grandfather and a person who participated in the massacre, Sheila proved to be a godsend. She circumvented my struggles with the ribbon composite of Lonnie's two personas by announcing, both publicly in groups like this one and privately to my family and me, that she forgave Lonnie more than I had. By forgiving Lonnie for his role in the Phillips County conflagration that produced attacks against her victimized ancestors, she deflated the potency of the damaged part of my tradition. By her forgiveness of Lonnie for his tendentious racist opinions and conduct and role in the massacre, she conveyed to me the assurance that I could proceed with her to friendship through a closer, honest dialogue, shared views, and personal stories. A shared purpose, if you will, and on this foundation, a willingness and aspiration could be created between us. Without the prospect for forgiveness exercised by those who sustained white aggression, who continue to carry long-term effects of the associated oppression. Whites, with the consequential impact of multi-generational damaged heritage, are simply not able to forgive themselves. They have no resources for such a forceful act. Indeed, whites in general aren't into forgiveness, even the acceptance of forgiveness, which I believe is necessary for racial reconciliation. We always knew within ourselves that we could only be cleansed by those we had made our victims, Black brothers and sisters among us. By so many measures, we whites must depend on African Americans to help guide us in a direction that will also allow us to forgive the what and who that have defined us in ways we often do not yet admit, and for so many, unfortunately, still choose to admire. More particularly, the use of forgiveness elevates African Americans, and at the same time releases whites to be free of their traditional commissions to turn whites from their historical participation in evil. Racial reconciliation strips away the previous context and replaces it with one that has set aside the evils and ravages of damaged heritage and filial pietism, one that has more fully taken on the adoption of the genuinely human. To receive another's situation captures the will of one's own purpose, thus finding one's self in the place of another. Further, for someone connected to the oppressing side, historically speaking, this pursuit of the genuinely human and reconciliation with another of a separate race, combined with an acceptance of forgiveness from those oppressed, can remove the self-destructive nature of a seemingly immutable past, transmuted to the present. For someone associated with the oppressed, to forgive the historical oppressor is an act of freedom for both, which can serve as an illumination and passage to a consciously elevated relationship. Racial reconciliation means the making of color irrelevant to all facets of our lives, economically, socially, spiritually. I propose we bring this idea always into a fully human setting, into a setting in which we can relate to the genuinely human possibility. Simply put, to ourselves. Dealing with the special nature of race, we too often assign much of our individual context to institutions, forsaking prospects we know we otherwise can bring entirely to bear between individual blacks and whites. While there is no doubt greater white activism at all levels is needed today in responding to racist episodes and comments, racial reconciliation is biracial, aligned with personally intense involvement. It is time for institutions to break open and free individuals of goodwill, black and white, to find each other in missions that result in authentic and public expressions of the genuinely human, depending instinctively on each other for the conduct, sentiments, and humanity to circumvent obstacles embedded in so many past ways and habits. I've occasionally let myself lean into the following possibilities. What if we whites allowed ourselves to pursue and fully embrace the genuinely human, accepting the commonality of all human beings, superseding and obviating those marginal facets such as accent, skin color, customs, and the like that American whites have used to segregate themselves from blacks? If all of that could happen, shouldn't we be able to mitigate, if not suppress, the long-living influence of filial pietism with its excessive reverence for ancestors, the past, and tradition? And if that were to happen, How could damaged heritage survive from generation to generation? And if we could add a little forgiveness exercised by African Americans, the equivalent of what Martin Luther King Jr. called the weapon of love. And if we whites could accept that forgiveness from African Americans, the kind of forgiveness that Sheila showed Lonnie, or the kind of forgiveness that the families of those killed at Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston showed to the white killer, Dylan Roof, isn't it possible that, dare I say it, we can contemplate something beyond, something over the mountaintop in visions like those of King and Isaiah that speak gently to us all about one to another, black to white, and white to black. Thank you.
So, okay. I'm unmuted. Thank you, Chester. Thank you for going through that and setting the table for us now to have a discussion. And I was wondering, as we start off, before I turn it over to Paula, whether you would like to summarize for those who haven't yet had a chance to read your book, exactly what the Elaine Race Massacre entailed, how many people, and over how long a period of time. So why don't I ask you to do that first?
Okay, it'll take a couple of minutes to talk about. At the end of World War I, African Americans came back to this country after having served in the military in Europe, believing that they would be treated differently than they had been prior to World War I. Some of them had been heroes, some of them had been decorated in Europe, and so they were optimistic as they were coming back to the shores of the United States. Whites throughout the country, not just in the South, but whites in this country rose up to dispel that information, that viewpoint. And there were racial conflicts throughout the country, from Arizona to the Northeast, and all places in between. In fact, journalists in the United States and internationally called this America's Race War. Things were even worse in the Mississippi River Delta, including southeast Arkansas and Phillips County. Phillips County being a very rich cotton producing county or section of the country. And cotton at that point had risen to be, the price was unbelievably high, at 50 cents a pound, which no one had dreamed it would be at an earlier time. And the sharecroppers, the black sharecroppers, the returning veterans, wanted their fair share, because the sharecropping structure in Phillips County was just a notch above slavery. That was, they received their supplies from a commissary, and when the crops would come in, they would sell their portion to the white planters, and the white planters would give them below market prices. And as a result, they wanted to be freed from the land. If you still had debt after having marketed your cotton and getting the proceeds and paying the commissary, if you still owed something, you were tied to the land, and inevitably they would be tied to the land. So they hired a law firm out of Little Rock to negotiate for them. They also decided to unionize, Progressive Farmers and Household Union. And the first night of full organization, there were 100 sharecroppers in Hoopspur Church. About 11 o'clock, Model T Ford pulled up in front of the the church, and two white men got out, the deputy sheriff of Phillips County and the security officer for Missouri Pacific Railroad, which was up to its eyeballs in this massacre, by the way. And they shot into the church to try to disturb the proceedings, etc. Unbeknownst to them, the Union had hired guards, and the guards fired back at the two white men. The Missouri Pacific agent was killed, and the deputy sheriff was shot in the knee. The deputy sheriff made his way back eventually that night to county seat. He said there was a black uprising insurrection occurring in Hoop Spur, just north of Elaine, and something needed to be done. The sheriff deputized a whole bunch of people, white folks, white men, who went back to Hoop Spur the following morning and started killing blacks. Somewhere between 15 and 20 African Americans were killed, and but 5 whites were killed. Now, of those 5, I believe 2 were killed by friendly fire. Now, the 5 included the Missouri Pacific agent who had been killed the night before. So again, the sheriff calls up the governor and says there's a black insurrection occurring. We need those federal troops that are sitting there in Fort Pike right outside of Little Rock. We've got to put down this black insurrection. So a call was sent to Woodrow Wilson's War Department to have access. The governor asked for access to the troops. Troops left Fort Pike with their machine guns and went to Phillips County. And for the next several days, there was considerable killing of African Americans. We don't know how many actually died, but from certain studies that the FBI and the Justice Department did immediately at the end of the conflict, probably at a minimal level, it was 80 of African Americans killed by the military. And then you had the additional from October, the morning of October the 1st, when the posses came to Hoop Spur and killed 15 to 20. And then there were vigilantes who came from neighboring communities and from Mississippi and Tennessee, who sort of drove through Phillips County and shooting African Americans ad hoc, and many of whom were in the fields and didn't even know what had happened at Hoop Spur. So that's the substance of what exactly happened. Now, in a very short, succinct way, there's a silver lining in all of this. There was a case after the conflict. 74 African Americans were tried and convicted of charges from first-degree murder to night riding. 12 of those were sent to the Walls Penitentiary in Little Rock to be executed. The way in which they were tried was egregious. And I mean, some juries deliberating for no more than 2 minutes on some of these cases. Well, I won't go into how they divide all this up. There was of those who had been found guilty of first-degree murder, there was a group called Moore 6. The Moore 6 appealed ultimately to the federal courts through an amazing African-American lawyer who actually took all 74 under his wing, and within 5 years, including the 12 that had been found guilty of first-degree murder, they were all free. But even beyond that, he didn't get to present the argument, but he wrote the brief in this case called Moore versus Dempsey. And in the case made it to the Supreme Court in 1923. And it was decided 6-2 on behalf of the sharecroppers. And at that point, the Supreme Court, for the very first time, determined that the federal government, federal court system, had the obligation to intercede on unfair prosecutions, decisions of judicial systems throughout the country. In 1868, 14th Amendment was passed with equal protection under the law. But the federal courts had determined between 1868 and 1923 that states had the right to determine the civil rights of all individuals within those states, which obviously lent itself to Jim Crow. But in 23, decision was made on behalf of the sharecroppers that the federal government could intercede. And that was effectively the beginning, in my opinion, was the beginning of the civil rights movement. A lot of, it's just court cases really come out in the last few years. Cambridge University Press in 2014 published a book called Civil Rights and the Making of the Modern American State. And it is all about Moore versus Gibson. So, and if you look at Brown versus Board of Education, it's all about equal protection under the law. So there's that silver lining, and I know I probably went on a little long about this discussion, but I get into it. Sorry.
Okay, thank you very much, Chester. I'm going to turn it over to Paula, and she'll take over for the Q&A.
Thanks a lot, Gabe, and thank you, Mr. Chester, for your history of the program. We really appreciate it. As you were talking, a lot of people were writing in the chat, and several people had questions they'd like to ask you. One question that I know came up, which I thought was an interesting question, is why is the South so seemingly more overtly racist than the North? Notice I said overtly. What was it? Where they migrated from, but what do you think the difference is? Why it was so tense in the South?
Well, that's it's a complex question, but because it has historical and sociological impacts on it. I think there was a nexus clearly between what I talk about in terms of this racism, but where I refer to, this filial pietism or this excessive veneration of the past ancestors and traditions, I think it was magnified in the South. And I think we obviously, it's symbolic today. I mean, we're having these arguments about, the Confederate statues and whether they should be up or down. And that's strictly a function of filial pietism. That's clearly part of it. But of course, the economics. I mean, this was, cotton was king, not just in the South, but for example, a lot of people don't realize this, but for a very large chunk of American history, New York City was second only to Charleston, South Carolina, as the slave trading city where most of that happened. And all over the country. It was the economics together with what I called filial pietism, and the South developed this sort of defensiveness as well. I mean, I talk about Reagan when he's running against Jimmy Carter. He goes to Neshoba County, where all these 3 civil rights workers were murdered by white supremacists. And there was sort of a collapse around that kind of viewpoint, of states' rights. And there is that nature of defensiveness that's derived from filial pietism. That's why I use this. There's so many answers of racism in this country that derives from this excessive veneration of the past. One of the biggest filial pietists, I'd say, in in American history and certainly American letters was William Faulkner. And but even he recognized the dangers of this combined damaged heritage and filial pietism. He said something like, "No man will cause more grief than that one who clings blindly to the vices of his ancestors." And I think that sort of summarizes a good portion.
That's interesting. Well, open it up to see if other people have questions. But one other thing that I wanted to ask you is with respect to your own spirituality and reconciliation. Did you have any reconciliation or spirituality having to deal with your grandfather himself being involved in the massacre, or how did you handle that?
Well, as I said, I lived with my maternal grandparents until I started the school, and my mother brought my older brother and me under one roof in that small town in southeast Arkansas, Monticello. Within, I don't know, maybe 6 to 9 months after my mother brought us together, Lonnie and I left Lonnie. Lonnie died, so I never had I didn't have that kind of longer term relationship. Although I did hear that he was pretty staunch agnostic. There's a story about the family when he was getting toward the end of his life, and they asked him where would he like to be buried and that sort of thing. He said, "Oh, don't forget, just forget, but throw me out in the backyard. We're all like dogs." So this, he was not a particularly spiritual person in respect. Although, Sheila, fascinating. Sheila Walker believes in him in a significant way. She considers that he was compassionate and loving, and she bases that on how I feel toward him. In fact, she goes so far as to say, I think he would have adopted the genuinely human, but he did not know how to do it. And when she forgave him, she said, people are born good, but bad circumstances make good people do bad things. And that was sort of the opening line to her forgiveness.
Did anybody else have any questions off the top of your head that you want to ask? If you want to raise your hand.
I see questions coming up on this. I don't know if they're just for me or for...
Well, if not, I'm happy to carry forward because we did have several questions. Another question that came up was the Tulsa riot, which seemed to be about the same time. How do you compare the two?
They were quite different. The Tulsa riot occurred 2 years following the Elaine massacre. One was obviously an urban environment, and one was rural. And that one reason that Elaine has not been known is because of its location. I mean, it happened 70 miles south of Memphis along the Mississippi River, and like over 100 miles from Little Rock, and the whites made it clear that blacks shouldn't be talking about this event. In fact, they sent right after the massacre, there were written notices sent out to black workers saying, "Stop talking about it. Stop talking about it." And but Tulsa is different. I mean, it was this other urban environment, and also the tactics used. I mean, the federal troops were brought in to attack African American sharecroppers and their families in Elaine. And then Tulsa, you had aircraft dropping bombs, and or the equivalents of bombs into Black Wall Street area of Tulsa. So, and in the way that it started, I would have to. I mean, there were in each case there were a lot of economic factors that played in. But I would have to say that in Elaine, they were much more to the surface. If you look the way in which Tulsa started, you know, there was this rumor about an African American getting on an elevator with a white woman and using her or something like that. When, you know, and it was, that was the rumor of it. And so, but in Elaine, it was the economic factors were immediately apparent.
Well, one question I have again is, what made you become not like your grandfather or become more racially inclusive?
Well, I wish I, you know, I don't have an easy answer to that. I did grow up in a racist family. I will say that one factor that played that was really important, and that was when I was at Harvard, and I made the decision that I would come back to try to understand the racial revolution and the Black liberation movement in the South. And for the next 3.5 to 4 years that I spent involved in trying to find, yeah, I went to school now and then, and yeah, I worked now and then as well. But the primary purpose of my doing that is to try to determine and come to terms with this phenomenon, this racial revolution that was occurring, and it had a deeply formative impact on me. After 4 years, as I said in my comments, my views had congealed and codified to an extent that I knew where I was, and it never. I mean, it's changed in some respects, but the core of way I thought and the experiences I had during that period of time really set me on a path that was decidedly different from the environment that I had known. I mean, one other factor, and I don't know what it was, but I'll mention it in any case. When I lived in this small town in Monticello, I lived on the other side of the tracks, so to speak. I lived on a place, Shelton Street. The parallel street is Jackson Street. Jackson was all African American, and Shelton was all white. And there was a field in the back of our yard. There were very few whites for me to play with. And there was a field in the backyard that where I developed close friendships in my first few years before the institutional segregation took hold, where I had good friends, African American friends. And I just know that later on, for example, when I played Little League, my favorite bat I always used was a signature bat by Larry Doby. I don't know if people know who Larry Doby was. Larry Doby was the American League equivalent of Jackie Robinson. Now, I was, you know, like 9 or 10 years old when I was doing this, and I've always sort of thought maybe this was an homage, an honor that I had placed on my relationships with these African Americans, these friends of mine. And I actually know that somewhere in the back of some influence on my coming back to teach in an all African American school before integration had something to do with that relationship that I had developed when I was very young with African American friends. Something I know that it was present.
Well, Dr. Joyce Pennifield would like to know, What do you think, what was the church doing in the time of the massacre? And I assume she means the Episcopal Church or whatever church you may have belonged to. Was there a response to the massacre, or did they participate or stand against the massacre?
Well, the first of all, does anyone know the name John Allen? Anyone know that?
Mhm.
Allen was a presiding bishop at one time. In St. John's Episcopal Church in Helena, which is the county seat, was the home of a lot of the white planters. And indeed, some of the documents that were prepared asking for a summary execution of the 12 African Americans were drawn up in the basement of St. John's Episcopal Church. Now, but they're so that the white planters participated. The Episcopal Church the local Episcopal Church was there and would serve to be a location for discussion of the white planters' position. So it was not as courageous, let's put it that way, as we would have hoped it would be at that time. But I'd like to make a personal comment, though, if I may. During that time that I was really dealing with where I felt that I wanted the evolution of myself in terms of race issues, I had previously gone to a Methodist church, and I kept going back to these southern white churches when the revolution, the racial revolution was really going on in the South. And there was substantial difference between what I heard in the pews of the white churches and what was going on outside. And I've said to a lot of people that the black church in the American South really salvaged my Judeo-Christian belief. I mean, if you look at the big names, the Selma and Birmingham and the Montgomerys, and I mean, what was the location of the movement and the language that dealt with civil rights? Well, it came out of those churches. And when you look at the white church during that period of time, we white folks struggled, and the churches struggled on the definition of neighbor. These churches were very much dedicated to the New Testament, but so much of that one heard in white churches from the pulpit did not deal with who was my neighbor. Black churches didn't have that problem in the South. And as a result, I mean, everybody was a neighbor. It was the genuinely human that connected people, as opposed to skin color having anything to do with it. So they were theologically much purer than the white church in the American South. And I recognized that at the time. Anyway, I'll pass. That's a little bit of a sidebar.
Now, that's interesting because Martin Luther King talked about the beloved community.
Right.
That's what we're trying to achieve, the beloved community. And how can we have a beloved community if we don't know who our neighbor is?
Right, exactly.
Yeah. So that's and that brings to the question that someone asked, what do you think about reconciliation? I mean, reparations, sorry.
Reparations?
Yeah, sorry.
Reparations. Well, I think, do y'all know who Catherine Meeks is? Y'all know who Catherine Meeks is? She runs the Absalom Jones Episcopal Center for Racial Healing in Atlanta, and it's it's associated with the Episcopal Church. I heard her talking about this, and her view on this is the beloved community is really an environment in which where we struggle to arrive at that point where the African American experience and the children of African Americans are treated in a way that is reflective of their value, of who they are and their own value. And that is where we should be striving for reparations as a way of life and as a commitment of love. And I have to tell you, the way that she presents it, I buy into her view about that. That it is the way, as opposed to, and I don't know what the alternatives would be, but that is the life that we should give African Americans and children of Africa, the opportunities that a beloved community represents. And that should be where we strive. And whether how we call it reparations or whatever, it is where we should be focused on over the long term.
Thank you very much, Chester. I know we are creeping to the end of our time frame, so I was going to ask you if you had any last words to kind of wrap up our time together.
Yeah.
Well, some people ask me, you know, because the book is called Damaged Heritage, and yet I don't define it precisely in the book because I make the assumption that most people know what damaged heritage is. At least those folks who have either have it in their background or they've experienced it. And I'm talking about both whites and blacks. They know what it is. And I have a strong opinion that, putting it on a personal basis, I didn't participate in the Elaine Race Massacre. I don't feel guilty about it. I mean, I'm not personally guilty of that. On the other hand, it is part of my inheritance. It is something I am influenced by it. It is part of who I am. And so, and if I don't deal with it, and I'm saying this across the board, mainly to the white folks, that if we do not deal with what we have inherited, then all we are doing is foisting it forward. And there were a bunch of folks in Arkansas, I love them to death, but you know, I heard comments about, why can't Chester leave, this was a few years ago, why can't Chester leave Elaine alone? You know, he doesn't have anything, just let sleeping dogs lie. And it was a function of my belief that if we do not, what we inherit as part of this damaged heritage, we don't deal with it, we forced it forward. And we have done nothing to stop the cycle of recurring racism in this country. We're talking about 400 years here. There's got to be not only a reason why filial pietism contributed to it, there's got to be a reason why it just keeps rolling along. And if people who have, whites who have this part, that they are part of the reason for it, if they don't address it, if they don't deal with it, all they have done is pushed it forward to the next generation of potentially other races. Okay. Well, thank you for giving me a last word there.
Okay, friends, I think we need to end our discussion there. Chester, thank you so much for your words of wisdom and for your experience and for teaching us a new term. I think you've left us all with a lot to think about. And I wanted to end with a prayer if I could find it in my prayer book.
Do that.
I'm going to pray a prayer for those of you who are Episcopalians. It's on page 815 in the Book of Common Prayer. It's a beautiful prayer, and we need to say it and pray it all the time. So I'll pray the prayer, and then we'll all say goodbye. The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Let us pray. This is for the human family. O God, you made us in your own image and redeemed us through Jesus, your Son. Look with compassion on the whole human family. Take away the arrogance and hatred which infect our hearts. Break down the walls that separate us. Unite us in bonds of love, and work through our struggle and confusion to accomplish your purposes on earth, that in your good time, all nations and races may serve you in harmony around your heavenly throne through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you for having me.
Of course, you're so welcome. All of our friends around the country and locally, God bless you. Have a wonderful rest of your day and have a beautiful, productive week. And Godspeed to you all. And thank you, Chester.
Oh,
Thank
thank you
you.
for having me.
Bye.
Bye, bye, bye,
Bye.
bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Okay, bye-bye.